Beneath the polished skyline of Detroit lies a world few dare to see, and even fewer survive. In this documentary, we infiltrate the heart of Michigan's homeless hell, where over 8,100 people live in tents, cars, and abandoned buildings as of January 2024. The scent of mold and gasoline fills the air. Children cry in the back seats of freezing cars, like one Detroit mother forced to raise her toddler in a rusted sedan. How can such desperation exist in one of America's wealthiest states? We're pulling back the curtain on a crisis that's been ignored for too long, and what we uncover may shake your faith in the system. Number 1. Michigan's hidden housing crisis. Let's step back and look at the full canvas. Not the city skyline, not the glossy brochures, but the raw, unsettling truth of what Michigan looks like in 2025. When you zoom in from the top floors to the cold concrete below, in the last few years, the state of Michigan, known for its Great Lakes car manufacturing legacy and iconic Motown rhythm, has quietly slid into a humanitarian crisis that few are willing to talk about. The numbers speak louder than any press release. Back in 2022, Michigan reported approximately 32,705 individuals experiencing homelessness. Fast forward just 1 year later, and that number rose by 2%, reaching 33,226. Now in 2025, advocates estimate that the total number of people without stable housing has edged even higher, especially with pandemic-era protections long gone. We are now looking at nearly 34,000 men, women, and children living in shelters, motels, tents, cars, or simply the streets. That's not just a number, that's the size of a small town gone invisible. So what's driving this surge? To find answers, we head to Detroit, a city that once symbolized American innovation, but now stands as a glaring example of deep inequality. Here, more than 1 in every 2 renters over 50% are paying more than 30% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. In housing policy, that 30% mark is a critical threshold. Cross it, and a family is officially considered housing cost-burdened. It means cutting back on food, on healthcare, on everything else just to stay indoors. And here's the kicker: rents keep rising, but wages not so much. According to housing advocacy groups in Michigan, the average rent for a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Detroit is now hovering around $1,100 per month. Meanwhile, the average renter income in the city is below $40,000 a year. That's not even close to enough. The math doesn't lie. And for thousands, the result is eviction, displacement, and eventually homelessness. But this crisis doesn't just live in the numbers. It breathes in the stories. Take a short drive down Grand River Avenue and you'll see it. Abandoned homes with shattered windows, clusters of tents lining alleyways, and makeshift shelters propped up under highway overpasses. At first glance, they look temporary, like someone just passing through. But look closer. There are rugs, toys, laundry hanging from the fencing. These aren't camps. These are communities born from crisis. And perhaps one of the most heartbreaking sights is found in the parking lot of a local grocery store, where a mother and her 4-year-old daughter have been living in their old rusted Ford sedan. She works part-time at a diner nearby, her daughter. She colors in a notebook as they wait for nightfall. It's safer here than in the shelter, the mother says, her voice barely audible over the buzz of fluorescent lights. So, how did we get here? How can one of America's most resource-rich states, a state that exports automobiles, medical equipment, and industrial goods across the globe, allow its own people to fall through the cracks? The answer lies in layers in economic shifts, failed policies, and the ever-widening gap between what things cost and what people earn. Michigan's affordable housing supply has never fully recovered from the last recession, and despite efforts to invest in new housing stock, the reality is sobering. Experts estimate that Michigan needs more than 140,000 additional affordable housing units to meet current demand. Yes, 140,000. And while the government has poured in new funding, including a recent $100 million investment in affordable housing for 2024, the gap remains, and it's growing faster than the walls can go up. The result: a bottleneck where more people are pushed out than welcomed in. And let's not forget, this crisis doesn't affect everyone equally. It disproportionately impacts Black and Indigenous communities, veterans, and LGBTQ youth, who face higher eviction rates and less access to safety nets. Still, what makes this even more haunting is what we don't see: the hidden homeless. The ones crashing on couches, cycling through friends' homes, or living out of motels 1 week at a time. They don't show up in the nightly news, but their stories are just as real. So when we talk about the homelessness crisis in Michigan, we're not just talking about tents and tarps. We're talking about a structural failure, a moral failing, a silent epidemic creeping through the suburbs, not just the streets. And that's why we're here, not just to expose what's wrong, but to ask the real questions, to shine a light on the darkness so we can demand better. Number 2. Why the system is failing thousands. To understand why thousands of people in Michigan are sleeping in cars, tents, or shelters tonight, we need to go beyond what we see and start asking why. Because homelessness doesn't just happen. It's not a choice. It's the outcome of systems breaking down slowly and silently. And there are 3 major cracks in the foundation. Let's start with the most obvious: the shortage of affordable housing. Now, to be fair, Michigan has tried. In the past few years, the state government invested heavily in housing initiatives, and by early 2025, they've managed to reduce the shortage of affordable housing by about 50,000 units. Sounds impressive, right? But hold on. Don't let the numbers fool you. The actual need across the state remains massive. According to the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, there are still more than 90,000 families on waiting lists for affordable homes. That's nearly double the number they've managed to help. And while supply struggles to catch up, rents keep racing ahead. Over the past 5 years, rental prices across Michigan, especially in urban centers like Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Ann Arbor, have risen by an average of 27%. Meanwhile, average wages have barely budged. Let that sink in. People's paychecks are crawling while their rent is sprinting. This widening gap creates an impossible equation for thousands of working-class families. They're not jobless. They're not lazy. They're working sometimes multiple jobs and still falling short. That brings us to the second root cause: the rising tide of poverty and economic instability. As of 2025, the average annual income for a renter in Michigan is around $39,000. Compare that to the statewide median income, which is about $67,000. That's a gap of nearly $30,000, a gap that makes all the difference between having a key or not. Now add in the rising cost of everything: groceries, gas, medicine, childcare. It's a pressure cooker. One surprise medical bill, one layoff, or one rent hike, and everything collapses. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, in order to comfortably afford a 2-bedroom apartment in Michigan at current rates, a household needs to earn at least $23 an hour working full-time. Yet the average renter is making closer to $15. You see the problem? And it's not just about income. It's about safety nets, or the lack of them. Which brings us to the third and perhaps most frustrating root cause: a broken social support system. Here's the truth. Michigan does have programs in place to help people who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless. There are emergency shelters, rental assistance, transitional housing programs. But here's the catch: only about 60% of eligible individuals are actually able to access that help. That means 4 out of every 10 people who qualify for support don't get it. Why bureaucracy? We're talking about complex paperwork, long wait lists, inconsistent communication between agencies, and a digital application process that leaves behind those without internet or ID. For someone who's already living on the edge, who's exhausted, traumatized, or working 2 shifts a day, these hoops can be impossible to jump through. Imagine this. You finally find a program that says it can help you show up. They tell you to apply online, but you don't have a laptop or an address or time to wait weeks for a response. So you give up, or worse, you go back to the streets. And that's not just hypothetical. That's real. According to a 2025 policy audit by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, Systemic inefficiencies and lack of cross-agency coordination were listed as major barriers to access across more than 70% of counties. So what we have here is a perfect storm. Not enough affordable homes, not enough income to pay for the ones that exist, and not enough functional support for those falling through the cracks. Each one of these factors on its own is enough to push someone closer to homelessness. Together, they form an unforgiving trap, one that catches more people each year. And it's not just numbers, it's people. People who worked hard, paid taxes, raised families, and now, because the system failed them, are living under bridges or inside broken-down cars. That's why this story matters, because behind every eviction notice, behind every no vacancy sign at a shelter, there's a human being, someone who didn't plan for this, who never thought this would be their life. Number 3, how homelessness impacts everyone. Let's dive into a deeper exploration of how Michigan's homelessness crisis is not an isolated issue, but a challenge that ripples through every facet of society. The effects are as wide-ranging as they are severe, touching the daily lives, safety, and economic well-being of entire communities. First, consider the disturbing link between high concentrations of homelessness and crime. In neighborhoods where the number of people without stable housing is significantly above average, local police reports reveal noticeably higher incidents of criminal activity. In these areas, crimes related to substance abuse and violence are particularly prevalent. Recent studies, including one conducted by the Michigan Department of Public Safety in 2025, indicate that regions with a homelessness rate exceeding 10% see a 25% higher frequency of drug-related offenses and violent crimes compared to neighborhoods with lower rates. Such statistics suggest that desperation and social isolation can create environments where criminal behavior not only finds fertile ground, but also erodes the overall sense of security in the community. Imagine walking down a street at dusk, where the silence is broken by distant sirens and the murmurs of unsettled residents. These aren't isolated episodes. They represent a persistent atmosphere of fear and vulnerability. Residents describe a constant tension where they feel as though they are on high alert. This heightened risk of crime doesn't just impact the homeless population, it directly affects everyone. Families begin to avoid using public spaces. Local businesses suffer and community trust dwindles. In effect, the homelessness crisis becomes a catalyst for further societal fragmentation, where the lack of stability for some undermines the safety and peace of many. Next, we must confront the staggering financial toll this crisis imposes on the government, a burden that stretches far beyond the individuals who experience homelessness firsthand. According to recent figures from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, the state currently spends approximately $9.5 billion each year on medical care for the homeless. Out of this enormous sum, about $3.5 billion is allocated solely to address mental health issues and behavioral disorders. These numbers are not just figures on a balance sheet. They represent real dollars that could otherwise be invested in preventive measures, education, or infrastructure improvements that benefit all Michiganders. When you consider these financial outlays, it becomes clear that the cost of ignoring the problem compounds over time. The government's inability to resolve the homelessness issue forces it into a cycle of reactive spending. Emergency medical services, hospital readmissions, and extended mental health treatments become the norm rather than the exception. This reactive approach is not sustainable in the long term. Every dollar spent on crisis management is a dollar diverted from proactive solutions that could rebuild communities and stabilize lives. Essentially, the financial burden on public funds is a call to action without effective intervention. The cycle will only tighten its grip, resulting in ever higher expenses and diminishing community well-being. Furthermore, the crisis strikes at the heart of the local economies, particularly through the process known as gentrification. Gentrification, while often touted as a sign of urban renewal, has a dark side when it displaces low-income residents. In Michigan's urban centers like Detroit and Grand Rapids, rising property values and rental costs have forced many long-term residents to leave their traditional neighborhoods. Local businesses, which once thrived on the patronage of a stable, closely knit community, are now grappling with the loss of a loyal customer base. In many cases, the new residents moving into these revitalized areas have different spending patterns and priorities, causing a shift in the local economic landscape. This displacement of residents is not a mere demographic shift. It is a profound alteration of the community fabric. Business owners report that when longtime customers leave their establishments, suffer a decline in sales. Real estate data from 2025 show that residential property values in gentrifying districts have surged by nearly 30% over the past 3 years. While this might sound positive at first glance, it simultaneously means that affordable housing options are vanishing at an alarming rate. As lower-income families are forced out, the unique character of these neighborhoods fades, leaving behind sterile, high-priced enclaves that fail to capture the community spirit that once defined them. The economic consequences are interwoven with the social ones. Displacement disrupts social networks and erodes the informal systems of support that many vulnerable individuals rely on. When families are uprooted from their communities, the accompanying loss of identity, history, and support intensifies the challenges they already face, often pushing them closer to the brink of homelessness. And as more families fall into despair, local economies suffer further. Small businesses that once provided essential services, both economic and emotional, find themselves unable to survive in a rapidly changing and increasingly exclusive market. All of these issues, rising crime, mounting government expenses, and the economic devastation wrought by gentrification, are not isolated. They are interlinked factors fueling a vicious cycle. The more unchecked the homelessness crisis becomes, the deeper its adverse impacts on society. Communities become less safe, public resources are stretched thin, and local economies are undermined by both displacement and stagnation. In summary, Michigan's homelessness crisis extends far beyond the individuals directly affected by it. It ignites a series of events that increase crime rates, place a heavy financial burden on public funds, and destabilize local economies through gentrification. These effects create a domino effect, where one problem feeds into another, making the situation even more challenging to reverse. The numbers, from the 25% surge in drug-related crimes in affected areas to the $9.5 billion spent on healthcare annually, are stark reminders that this isn't just a personal tragedy for those without homes. It's a societal crisis that demands urgent, comprehensive solutions. By understanding these interconnected layers, we gain a clearer picture of why Michigan, a state rich in resources and history, struggles so profoundly with homelessness. It challenges us to rethink our priorities, reallocate our resources wisely, and commit to building a future where stability and opportunity are not luxuries but the cornerstones of every community. Number 4. COVID's aftershock on housing. If homelessness in Michigan was already simmering before the pandemic, COVID-19 turned up the heat and then ripped the lid right off. For many, the global pandemic was a time of isolation, uncertainty, and struggle. But for thousands of Michigan residents, it marked the moment they lost what little stability they had left. Homes, jobs, healthcare, everything. In 2022 alone, the number of unhoused individuals in Michigan surged by 8% compared to the previous year. That's not a dip in the data, that's a spike, and it didn't come out of nowhere. One of the biggest turning points came with the end of emergency support programs, especially the COVID Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or CERA. For nearly 2 years, this program served as a financial lifeline for tenants who had fallen behind on rent due to job losses or medical bills. At its peak, CERA helped more than 140,000 households across the state, preventing thousands of evictions and keeping vulnerable families off the streets. But by mid-2022, the funding dried up. The program shut down, and just like that, a safety net that was barely holding things together disappeared. Now let's be clear, CERA wasn't perfect. Some applicants waited months for relief, some never received it. But for many low-income families, especially those working hourly jobs or living paycheck to paycheck, it was the only thing standing between them and homelessness. When that support vanished, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Landlords, many of whom had been holding off on evictions during the emergency period, quickly resumed proceedings. Courtrooms across Michigan reported a sharp rise in eviction filings, according to the Michigan State Housing Court System. Evictions jumped by nearly 35% in the first 3 months following the end of escalate. That's tens of thousands of families suddenly facing displacement, often with no warning and nowhere to go. And here's the kicker. While the pandemic was receding for some, its economic aftershocks were only beginning for others. Service industry jobs, once considered safe, had not fully rebounded. Many small businesses had shut down permanently. Childcare costs had soared, making it even harder for single parents to return to work. So when emergency aid disappeared, people weren't just left without help. They were left worse off than before the pandemic even began. But the damage wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Picture this family's living in hotels with eviction notices taped to their doors, not knowing where they'll sleep next week. Parents trying to log their kids into virtual school from the backseat of a car. Elderly tenants who hadn't missed rent in decades now trying to understand why their home is no longer theirs. This wasn't just economic collapse, it was human collapse. And yet somehow it was preventable, because the truth is, emergency support worked while it lasted. Sarah and similar programs kept people housed. They kept children in school. They prevented the spiraling costs of homelessness. The ER visits the emergency shelter, stays the law enforcement calls. In fact, national data shows that every dollar spent on homelessness prevention saves at least $3 in public spending down the line. But when those programs ended without a transition plan, the state simply pushed thousands of families off a cliff. No parachute, no plan B. And here's where it really hits hard. The pandemic was supposed to be a wake-up call, a once-in-a-generation moment to rethink how we treat housing, healthcare, and human dignity. But instead, once the headlines faded and the masks came off, many of the old problems came roaring back, only this time they had new momentum. Today, in 2025, the ripple effects are still being felt. Shelters across the state report record high, occupancy rates often turning people away due to lack of space. Food banks are seeing longer lines while transitional housing programs are maxed out. And the people showing up for help, they're not who you might expect. They're school bus drivers, medical assistants, restaurant staff. People with jobs, kids, and once steady routines now caught in a storm they didn't create and can't escape. So what does all this mean? It means the pandemic didn't just expose a crisis, it accelerated one. It peeled back the thin veil covering a housing system that was already stretched too thin, too slow, and too underfunded. And when the emergency resources dried up, Michigan's most vulnerable were left stranded in the wreckage. But here's the thing, it didn't have to be this way. This moment, this unraveling could have been the start of a real reckoning. A push for permanent solutions, for housing as a human right, for funding that doesn't just plug holes, but rebuilds the foundation. Instead, what we got was a bandage ripped off too soon, exposing wounds that were never healed. Number 5. Why current solutions fall short. Let's talk about solutions, or rather the solutions that were supposed to solve the problem. In 2024, the state of Michigan made headlines by announcing a massive investment in affordable housing, $100 million. On paper, it looked like a bold move. Press conferences were held, ribbons were cut, blueprints were unveiled. But here's the uncomfortable truth for the tens of thousands of people struggling to find a place to live. Not much changed. Why? Because that $100 million injection, while significant, was still just a drop in the bucket compared to the scale of the crisis. Experts at the Michigan Housing Development Authority estimate the state needs over 140,000 additional affordable housing units to meet existing demand. That means the current funding could only cover a fraction of what's truly needed. And let's not forget, building homes takes time. Permits contractors, years of red tape. So while politicians celebrated the budget boost, families on waiting lists kept waiting, and waiting. In the meantime, the cost of housing continues to climb, especially in cities like Detroit, where a different problem has taken root: gentrification. Now, at first glance, gentrification sounds like progress. Blighted buildings get restored, cafes open, streets look cleaner, but peel back the surface and the picture gets darker. In Detroit, over the past 5 years, rental prices in gentrifying neighborhoods have risen by more than 30%, according to a 2025 housing market report. And that's not just statistics, that's real. Families being pushed out of their communities. Long-time residents, many of whom have lived in the same zip code for decades, suddenly find themselves priced out by the very revival that was meant to improve the city. It's like being evicted by prosperity. And this isn't just an economic issue, it's a cultural one, a social one. As lower-income families are forced out, so too are the small businesses, community centers, churches, and schools that anchored those neighborhoods. What's left behind is a shinier, sleeker version of the city, but one that feels hollow, like a museum built on top of a memory. Take Southwest Detroit, for example. Once a vibrant hub for Latino families and small ethnic businesses, the area has now seen a sharp uptick in luxury lofts, high-end grocery chains, and boutique clothing stores. The result: many residents have been pushed to the outskirts where public transit is scarce. Services are limited, and rents are still rising, just slower. This cycle investment that benefits the few while displacing the many is playing out across Michigan, not just in Detroit. In Grand Rapids, Lansing, and even smaller towns like Ypsilanti, gentrification is reshaping the map. And without robust tenant protections or inclusive development policies, the trend shows no sign of slowing down. So while the state pours money into housing projects, the deeper question is, who are we building for? Are these units truly affordable for the people who need them, or are they affordable by market standards, meaning still out of reach for someone earning minimum wage? And here's the kicker. Many of the so-called affordable units being built today are priced for people making 60 to 80% of the area median income, which excludes many families living below the poverty line. So even when new buildings go up, those most in need are often left staring from the sidewalk. The irony is painful. The system designed to reduce homelessness is in some cases feeding it. By revitalizing neighborhoods without protections in place, we risk solving one problem while creating another. So what do we take from all this? The reality is, throwing money at the issue isn't enough. Not if the underlying structures aren't fixed. We need targeted policy, community-driven development, and above all, accountability. Because right now, the gap between intention and impact is wide enough for entire families to fall through. As one housing advocate in Detroit put it, we're building more than ever. But if no one who actually needs housing can afford to live there, then what exactly are we building? That's the question Michigan and the country needs to answer. Number 6, a blueprint for real change. One thing should be clear. The homelessness crisis in Michigan isn't a mystery. It's a mirror. But here's the good news. It's not beyond repair. If the system is broken, that means it was built. And if it was built, it can be rebuilt smarter, stronger, and more compassionate. So let's talk about what a sustainable solution actually looks like in 2025 and beyond. Let's start with what matters most: a place to live. Affordable housing is not just a buzzword. It's the cornerstone of every meaningful strategy to combat homelessness. Right now, Michigan is short by more than 140,000 affordable units. That's a massive gap, but it's not an impossible one to close. We need to move beyond temporary fixes and rental subsidies and start thinking long-term. That means investing in large-scale construction of public and deeply affordable housing, the kind that isn't tied to market rates or luxury developers. And yes, that includes reviving public housing, a term that's unfairly gathered dust in political debate, but could hold the key to lasting stability for thousands. Take Finland, for example. The country implemented a housing-first model, where permanent housing is given without preconditions. Since then, homelessness has dropped by over 60%. Why not Michigan? If we reallocate funding toward permanent, publicly managed housing instead of short-term shelters, we not only give people a roof, we give them a future, But housing is only one piece of the puzzle. Next up, policy reform. Right now, too many support programs are tangled in red tape. Applications are long, requirements are vague. And for people who have no internet, no mailing address, no documentation, navigating the system feels like running an obstacle course blindfolded. We need to simplify these processes, a single intake form, clearer eligibility guidelines, better tech support, and real human help, not just automated phone lines. In 2025, we have the tools to make things easier, so let's stop letting paperwork be the barrier between a person and their second chance. And while we're rebuilding the system, we must build it with health in mind, especially mental health. Right now, more than 40% of people experiencing chronic homelessness in Michigan also struggle with a mental illness or substance use disorder. That's not a coincidence, that's a wake-up call. If someone's battling depression, schizophrenia, or addiction, a roof helps. Yes, but without accessible, ongoing mental health support, they'll be right back where they started. That's why sustainable solutions mean investing in community clinics, mobile crisis teams, and long-term behavioral therapy programs. And not just in urban centers, but in suburbs, rural counties, and tribal areas too. The crisis is statewide, so the care must be too. And here's where the approach gets powerful: collaboration. No single agency can fix this alone. That's why real solutions require partnerships between state and local governments, nonprofit organizations, healthcare systems, housing developers, and yes, businesses too. Imagine this: a coalition where city planners work alongside trauma counselors, where construction firms build with input from social workers, where formerly homeless individuals are employed to help guide housing programs, using their lived experience as a blueprint for change. It's already happening in small pockets like the Detroit Housing Partnership, which in 2025 has helped place over 3,000 individuals into stable housing by working with both public and private sectors. The model works, it just needs scale. And finally, the last piece of this puzzle: economic opportunity. Because the truth is, housing alone won't end homelessness. People need jobs, skills, confidence, a way to move forward. Not just survive, but thrive. That's why any long-term plan must include job training programs, vocational schools, apprenticeships, and employment assistance for those exiting homelessness. We're talking career pathways, not just minimum wage placements. And it doesn't stop at the job offer. Ongoing wraparound support like childcare, transportation, and peer mentorship can mean the difference between staying housed and slipping back into the cycle. As of this year, Michigan's Rework initiative has piloted programs that combine job training with transitional housing and mental health care. Early results show that more than 70% of participants are still housed and employed a year later. That's what success looks like. Not handouts, but on-ramps. So where do we go from here? We stop treating homelessness as a symptom and start addressing the root causes. We stop asking, why are people on the street, and start asking, why did we let them fall in the first place? Because this isn't just a housing crisis, it's a moral one. The good news, Michigan, is at a crossroads. And what we choose to do next will say everything about who we are and who we're willing to fight for. Because when we build better systems, we don't just save lives, we rebuild hope. Homelessness in Michigan isn't just a statistic, it's a story unfolding in real time on real streets in real lives, from the root causes of poverty and unaffordable housing to the far-reaching impact on crime, public health, and community identity. This crisis is everyone's problem and everyone's responsibility. But here's the truth: we must carry forward. Solutions do exist. They require courage, compassion, and above all, commitment. From expanding affordable housing to building mental health support and creating job opportunities, we have the tools. Now we need the will. If this story moved you or opened your eyes to a reality often ignored, consider being part of the change. Like this video, subscribe to NVL Travel Documentary for more journeys into the hidden corners of our world, and share your thoughts below. Your voice matters, and together, maybe we can help rewrite the ending. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking, and keep caring.